provider that I just pointed out to you, who's helped us whittle down the wait list, but now finds themselves out of money halfway through the year, really points up the need for, there ought to be consistent funding for this every year, and not what you can get away with one year and then see if you can, what you can do the next year. So the budget looks good. It will permit the department to continue working on wait lists, and the one that I always use, which is just the easiest to illustrate, is community integration wait list. Currently, when I checked it today, there are 554 people with severe and persistent mental illness on the wait list for community integration, the most basic mental health service that we provide. And they're waiting for an average of 40 days. But within that average is hidden people who have waited for as much as a year. So the wait list is a very serious problem. So the budget will permit them to continue working on that. And as they've worked on it in the last year, 6 or 8 months really, done some process improvement stuff, dug into it a little bit, actually started calling, the department calls people who have been waiting for more than 60 days and tries to find out what the situation is. They're working with the providers. And we're learning that yes, it's money, and so obviously the budget is critical to addressing this wait list, but also we're learning that it is also the availability of staffing. That there's a deficit in the number of community integration workers. If we were to all of a sudden bring everybody in and take care of the wait list, we're shy. We're not up to where we should be. And that may be a tribute to the fact that we've been sort of sporadic about how we've funded this. People are reluctant to take on employees if they don't know whether the funding is for a half a year or for the whole year. So they're working on that. So on that level, I'm encouraged that this budget, as presented, will give them the tools to demonstrate that they can take a sizable whack out of that wait list and bring this down to the consent decree talks about 2 days and 3 day wait period for the assignment of community integration workers. I'd be content if we were talking something reasonable in 7 days, 10 days. I mean, you know, it's the one thing we've learned is that by the time somebody waits 90 days, they disappear. You can call, you can't find them, you don't know whether they're in jail, where they're at. But if you don't respond to that need, I mean, these are people who are severe and persistently mentally ill, and you just can't leave them sitting there for 90, 120, 160 days without the most basic service. So that's the picture on the community. Let me turn quickly to Riverview. The Riverview problem, as I see it, is in its operation, and it's a safety for staff and clients, and as implicated by the need for law enforcement and weapons in the hospital. When I say weapons, I mean tasers, pepper spray, handcuffs. That's the problem. Running an operation that is safe for both clients and staff. It is a very difficult and challenging environment. It requires the best of the best. I mean, ideally, this hospital would have the best nursing staff in Maine because it is the most demanding environment that you can have. We have some of the best on staff. We don't have enough of the best on staff. They're a little bit stretched too thin. So we need we need staff, and we need a lot of training for everybody, including the best of the best. They need to be trained. About 2 or 3 months ago, I had Elizabeth Jones, who used to be the receiver of the hospital 10 years ago, come up and do a site visit, and she rendered a report and made a number of recommendations. The department has responded to those recommendations and we work them back and forth until they're the response is in a basically acceptable form. On January 30th, which is next week, I guess, we'll present the department's response to Judge Horton, who is the judge who oversees the consent decree, and ask for his approval and advice as to whether we're on the right road. This is not interfering with your operation. This is strictly within the consent decree. But I can say that those responses involve increased staffing and less reliance on contract staffing and locum tenens staffing. And that the plans they are presenting to the judge on the 30th are totally supported by and consistent with the budgetary plans that are before you. I mean, their staffing changes are supported by the budget. So when we go to the judge, we have, okay, here is the plan, and it isn't in total final form, but it will look like this. And here is the budget actually proposed that will support that plan. And so we're hoping that will provide some assurance that we're doing everything that can possibly be done to ensure that we're moving in the right direction. And I am confident that we are moving in the right direction. Before I shift to the budget of the hospital, I was going to clean up what arose when the commissioners started here, because on the status of the dispro share funding and CMS, because that's sort of been misunderstood. Except for a brief interruption of a month or two, the department has continued to draw down disproportionate share funding ever since the certification became an issue. So disproportionate share funding has continued to come in, and that's what has allowed the hospital to operate. You heard the commissioner's description of it and the possible outcome. There is some risk that it would have to be paid back. An audit could result in a requirement of repayment, whatever. It's not clear one way or the other, as you heard here. But it's, you know, as business people, you would say, there's a risk of that. It's a high risk. So it's wise to think of it as there. But at this point, we're operating on the assumption that disproportionate share continues. And so when you look at the budget, you will see that there's a Riverview section that is Riverview generally, and then there's Riverview disproportionate share funding. So in order to know what is it that they're doing for the hospital total, you have to put the two of them together. And so as they add a position, you will often find that part of the position is in one and part of the position is in the other. So it's the combination. And then if you go back and look at what I anticipate will be emergency spending bills, that really gives you the whole picture. What are they doing from this date through the biennium? I'll give you my quick and dirty version of what the whole looks like. The budget includes an additional $2.5 million for the first year of the biennium and $1.4 million for the following year. The spending requests I anticipate for the current year will be 1.6 roughly, and roughly $1,943,000 or something like that. So there's a significant chunk of money that's going into the operation of the hospital, and as you'll see, it's largely in staff, either new staff or converting contract staff or locum tenens staff to regular staff. And that's very important. I think the biggest item you'll find in there is they propose to create 4 staff psychiatric positions. Well, they have 4 psychiatrists now. but they're contract and locum tenens, which means that they're changed every once in a while. The locum tenens stay maybe a month or two, and maybe 3 or 4 months. But it is not an exaggeration to say that often the person who knows the treatment plan best may very well be one of the advocates or one of the nurses who have been there, because the psychiatrists are coming and going. That's not to fault them, it's the only thing that we can do under the current situation, but that is not a good situation. I mean, one of the critical things that we pointed out on the operation of Lower Saco was you have these floating employee mental health workers at the lowest level of staff who have never been trained for Lower Saco, which is the most acute unit, and all of a sudden there's a shortage, and so they have to float them in. And they said, that is not a good situation. People should be trained to work on Lower Saco. The people who work there should be assigned to that unit because they develop an understanding of the triggers that set some of these people off. Well, it also applies to the psychiatrists as well. I mean, it's probably critically important that the psychiatrists have that on. So that's the direction in which they're moving, and it's a good direction, and it is supported by the budget that will be before you and the spending requests that I anticipate. This will put Riverview in a position to establish safe operations under challenging circumstances. Will it work? It depends upon the execution. It's got the right ingredients. It's got the right funding. It's the best opportunity we will ever have to achieve what we want. But it'll depend upon the execution. The only item in the budget that I would call to your attention when it finally gets before you is that I think that the training, if you would add up all of the different funding sources that I've talked about, the training comes out to be totals less than $40,000 for the balance of this year, and 40 and 15 and 16, and less than 20 for 16 and 17. I think they may be shortchanging the training a little bit. I'm not an expert on that, but I would encourage you to, when Jay and the commissioner come back to discuss the Riverview budget in detail, I would encourage you to take a look at training, because that seems like it's pretty modest training, and that is a major difficulty in the current operation, is that the absence of training sort of makes their operation that much more difficult, and it shows up in some of the incidents. The couple of final things that I want to talk about is the continuing problem at the hospital, and what we have to overcome in one way or another, is the fact that law enforcement officers are occasionally required on the units, particularly on the forensic units. And when they come, they bring weapons, taser, pepper spray, and handcuffs into the hospital. Currently, the hospital requires, there's no question, if a client, a patient at the hospital commits a crime and is not psychotic at the point that he commits it, the hospital can call the police, he can be arrested, or she can be taken out. That's not an issue. The question, CMS acknowledges that. The question really is, can the hospital call the police for the purpose of subduing a patient that they can't handle, to help them put them back into seclusion, restraint, or whatever is needed? And that is the real issue. And that's what got them into trouble with CMS. It has improved. First of all, law enforcement are no longer on the forensic units. They were there, right in the unit, 24/7, 24. They're not there. They're available either through the Capitol Police or Augusta PD, but they're not on the units unless they're called. Secondly, they're called far less often than they were being called a year ago. In the past couple of months, according to reports I've received, they've been called in 3 times, and all with regard to the same patient. And each time they assisted in subdued the patient, put him into a seclusion, and that was the end of it. So they're not on the unit, they're called less often, and most importantly, what wasn't happening, every time they show up, it's reported. It's reported to me, it's reported to the Adult Protective Services, and investigated if it's necessary. And finally, there's a clean handoff from the clinical to the law enforcement when this is necessary. Before, there was sort of a mixture that the clinical was helping the law enforcement and vice versa, and it was kind of unclear who was in charge and who was doing what. And the incident that caused one of the most problems, sort of the clinical was directing, why don't you go ahead and do what you want to do. 3 strikes and you're out was sort of the thing. Now there's a neat and clean handoff, so that when the law enforcement is called, the clinical folks say, we are handing you this situation. You are in charge. And the law enforcement officer take over, put them into restraint, seclusion, or whatever. The problem with that is that CMS seems, I've read the regulations, from my reading of it, CMS seems to say you can't, in a hospital that is certified by CMS, use law enforcement with weapons for the purpose of subduing patients. You can use it for law enforcement purposes, but when you call them, you have to be calling them with the expectation that criminal charges will follow and that person will be arrested. It may turn out that they aren't, but that has to be your expectation. But you can't, it seems, under CMS, just call up and say, we're having trouble with Dan Wathen, would you come over and help us put him into seclusion? CMS seems to prohibit that. It isn't clear to me at this point whether, separate and apart from CMS, whether the consent decree prohibits it or has anything to say about that. And we're going to discuss that with the judge on the 30th when we meet with him. And I'll probably have some sort of position on it myself at that time. I think I'm leaning towards the fact that the consent decree doesn't prohibit that. If it can't safely be done with safety to the client as well as to the staff, it seems to me that it has to be. You just can't allow damage to be done unnecessarily if the police can prevent it. So that's sort of my pragmatic inclination, but we've got to really look at that more carefully. And as I say, we will discuss that with the court. But that is a problem for CMS, and it will continue to be a problem with them as long as we continue to rely upon and need to rely upon police for the purpose of subduing. My goal would be that we get to the point where we don't ever call the police for the purpose of subduing the patient. But I'm not sure that that's achievable. But under the current situation, we have some very difficult situations. So it's not. I get the report of events every day, the ones that are handled, and they're really, the list for a week is a page and a half long, probably 12, 15. Almost every one of them involves assault, throwing hot coffee, patient on patient, patient on staff. So it's a very difficult situation. But ideally, that's where we want to get. Hospitals do not use police officers to subdue their patients, period. But we're not there yet. And finally, I think that at some point, this session, Committee of Jurisdiction will probably get this. I would hope that there would be a bill put in by the department to authorize the use of involuntary meds for the forensic population. It sort of, and there's all sorts of concerns about that and so on and so forth. But we have involuntary meds for the civil population. We don't have a procedure for involuntary meds for the forensic population. And so the sort of the lack of logic struck me when I was confronted with a situation that the psychiatrist was pointing out to me that, look, we have this guy here, he's been found to be incompetent to stand trial. He's going to stay 6 months before he's determined whether he's restorable or not. And we can't medicate him. And he is just raising holy hell on the unit every day. And we're going to allow that to go on without medication for 6 months. And he's going to be in exactly the same situation at the end of 6 months. What do we do with him then? Do we put him on the street? No. We probably blue paper him and bring him back in on the civil side of the hospital as being a threat to himself or others, at which point he can have involuntary meds. So what we've done is we've terrorized the unit for 6 months just because we don't have the mechanism for medicating this person in the manner to which they should be medicated. So I think that will come along. That is not a panacea. That is not the solution to our problems. That is just the most obvious lack of logic in the current setup. So that is my impressions at this time.
Senator Haskell has a question for you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being here today. And you did talk about the fact that there are people there who are either awaiting disposition or are awaiting competency determination, so people who have not been found guilty of a crime as yet.
Right.
And this is part of the issue. I was hoping that you'll be able to come and speak to the Health and Human Services Committee and we can have an in-depth conversation. But at that time, my understanding is that Cumberland County, the Kennebec County DA is getting a significant number of requests for speedy criminal charges to be brought in order to try and do a better job of managing that population. And I'm not sure where those are all coming from. I would hope that that could be part of our discussion, and we could take a look at that and how that's truly impacting justice, the balance of justice based on these treatment needs. So
yeah, I will certainly be available as a discussion that really needs to be held, because the one solution from the hospital, and I don't think they've done it, but it would be to say, every time someone has an assault, they should be charged. And that puts them in jail. We want them in jail, not here. We can't handle them, so put them over there. That has been done once or twice. The jail here in Kennebec is in no position to respond to that. That is not the solution to the hospital situation. There have been a couple of instances where there was no choice. I mean, there was it really should be discussed fully, and it will give rise to the broader discussion Representative Petit was talking about. Okay, what are we going to do with this population? So, that's it.
Okay. And I got Senator Valentino.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much. Justice Wathen, I have a few questions and more a clarification of a couple of points. One is we just heard from the Commissioner that Riverview is still receiving the money under that. And I'm just wondering, because I was looking at your Courtmaster's progress report to the court back in August, and you had mentioned in that report that the hospital was only operating at 85% capacity because you were operating under a 2/3 budget. that was deprived from Medicare, Medicaid, and the disproportionate share. So I'm just wondering, did something change, or so are we working at a full budget? So my question is, are we working at a full budget at Riverview now, or are we at 2/3 of budget? And are we still at only 85% capacity?
I didn't connect the precarious dispro share funding to the level of operation of the hospital in my report. I may have misled you into that, but I didn't mean to say that. The reason that their capacity was down was because at that point they were about 60% forensic, and they just didn't have the staff that would allow them to use the beds that they had available. And so they were operating at 70% capacity and so on and so forth. They're now up to about 92% capacity. And importantly, they have restored, with one exception, that the hospital is, half of the hospital is civil, half of the hospital is forensic, which was what happened a couple of years ago. The whole thing became some forensic. So they're up to 92%. They run about 4 or 5 beds available for civil, usually. They usually try to keep 1 bed available for lower SACO, for something really bad that might come along. And upper SACO is usually full. So they run about 92%.
Okay.
And it has nothing to do with the budget there. It has more to do with their staffing levels and their ability to handle people.
Okay, and just 2 more clarifying points. One is, I was under the impression last year that we had changed Capitol Police, that there would be a presence there all the time. And because previously, for I think 10 years before, they had just responded to emergencies. You're saying there is no presence?
No, on the unit. They're there.
Oh, so they're there?
They're there, they're in the building.
Okay.
If
So
you
there
get
is-
over for a visit, you go by the security officers on the way in, and you turn, and there's a little office right off there, just before you go into the next door. That's where Capitol Police are located. They're there, and you will see an item in the budget under Capitol Police where there's I've forgotten the amount, but he gets charged to Riverview.
Okay, so just the clarifying point is that
They're
there is a
there.
full-time presence on the
There's a
campus,
full-time
just
presence.
not on the unit.
And the only time I think they're not there is at certain evening hours, and they call Augusta PD to fill in. If Capitol is not there, they call Augusta PD.
And I guess my final question is, the consent decree was from 1990, where we're talking 25 years.
Right.
What is the end game for this consent decree? How much money does it take to waive that, or how many changes? I mean, for 25 years, we've been talking about this consent decree. What is the end game?
Yeah. It takes the money that is in the present budget plus execution.
Well, that's what I'm wondering, how much money, how much staff?
Exactly what's in this present budget.
And then we'll be able to.
If they can't do it on this, they can't do it. There's something wrong.
So if we appropriate this money, that should be able to, within a year or 2 years, solve our consent decree problem?
It should,
Okay.
and but I'm not guaranteeing it will happen. I'm saying it depends upon the execution. And it is a challenging assignment at Riverview to accomplish that. But this gives them every tool that Elizabeth Jones thought they needed, and every tool that they thought they needed themselves, and it's a question of how well they carry off. And it won't be totally, it's not going to be easy to find 4 psychiatrists, for example. Staff psychiatrists that are there full time. So there's some real challenges in that. But in terms of how much, how long, this much is what I'm telling you.
Okay.
Yeah. And I've been saying it on the community side. I've been saying this for 6 or 8 years now, give us the $5 or $6 million, do it consistently every year, and let them work their way out of this wait list hole. And we haven't done it. So if we do it and put it in the base, that should permit them to make a substantial inroad on the wait list. But it's complicated because we know it is not just money, it's also workers. And that should be good news, that we really need to hire probably 45 providers, need to hire 45 caseworkers, something like that.
Representative Bernstein?
Bernstein,
Bernstein.
yes. Thank you, Senator. My question, I hope this is the right forum. Has it been thought about to hire mid-levels, like being nurse practitioners, I mean, the nurse practitioner schools are just overflowing at this point. So that's
yes,
my first
they
question.
have physician's assistants, they have nurse practitioners, they have all of the range of folks, and they all do. Many of them do excellent work. Because if you have 4 psychiatrists, that doesn't give you 724. That gives you, one shift a day. So PAs and nurse practitioners fill in.
But they could take the place of psychiatrists in many, many cases, and well, that's just the thought.
They do.
Yeah, so
they do. There's no question about it. And I mean, but they aren't going to remove the need for psychiatrists.
right.
Yeah. So you'll see it when Jay comes over. He can tell you exactly how many PAs there are, how many nurse practitioners there are. And they are vital to the daily operation of Lower Saco. I mean, I can tell you the woman who was the nurse practitioner on Lower Saco was probably one of the most effective people I know.
I have a second question. My other question was about the assaults and having the police. What about other places? What do they do? You know, I mean, this problem is probably happening in other hospitals as well. So I'm just wondering, like, do you have to?
The answer is no, it's not necessarily happening at other hospitals. That there are hospitals, and Riverview at one point was able to operate restraint-free. And that's what we've lost. And it was the culture shift from a hospital. When you go to a hospital, you don't expect to be thrown on the floor by your practitioner and restrained. I mean, that's not a good way to establish your therapeutic relationship. So all of a sudden, the law enforcement culture sort of took over the hospital culture. And that's what we've got to correct. And Riverview operated, I've been involved with it for 10 or 12 years. 10 of those years, there was probably one guy that really was a real serious problem. Couldn't be handled by, they're very good at handling these people. But all of a sudden, the forensic population built up, starting about 2012, got out of control. Instead of having 1 or 2 people who were difficult to handle, they had 7 or 8, and they had them in all 4 units of the hospital. And all of a sudden, they didn't have anything they could do except call in law enforcement. And they, for whatever reason, chose not to report that. It's one thing to call it in. It's another thing to report that you've done it. That's the lesson. So, yes, the hospital, it still has a fairly high seclusion rate, has a fairly high restraint rate. It has always had a higher than national average seclusion and restraint rate. They justified that by saying, yeah, but the periods of seclusion and restraint are shorter. They're not as long as the, so we do it a lot, but we don't keep you in very long. Questionable whether that's a good thing or not. I think you'd be better off to use seclusion and restraint less often. But then all of a sudden, we lost hold of seclusion and restraint, and we went to involvement with police officers with weapons, and in a period of 6 months, when really it wasn't being reported at all, and I knew only of 1 or 2 incidents, there were 44 occasions when they called in law enforcement officers and used or threatened to use weapons. So that's what we were correcting.
Representative Stuckey, you're still
Thank you, Senator. I think you just spoke to my question, Judge, which was, what other than the weapons do the police officers bring to the scene?
Well, to some extent, police officers are physically and from a training perspective and physically probably better equipped than some of the hospital staff. But I think in a large measure it's the weapons. Yeah, it is the weapons. And if you call the police, as you know, you can't call them and say, I want you to come over to my house, but don't bring your gun in, okay? And don't bring any handcuffs or pepper spray or anything like that. They don't do that. It's like calling, I've done it with the fire department. I said, I'm not sure, I may have a problem. Come over, but don't bring the truck. For God's sakes, don't turn the siren on. In they come, roar. They are there to do their job. And their job involves the use of these weapons because that's how they subdue people without getting hurt themselves. So that's what they bring, and we really ought to, as long as it's necessary, we may have to do that, but we really ought to work towards having a hospital where we don't do that. And it's important that the people who work with these patients every day, and there's a provision in the proposal that they do unit-based staffing, which means, okay, we're going to have the same people working on the same unit. That's important because the difficult people have identifiable triggers. You know, you can see when they're getting agitated.